My guest today is Bas van Rossum, a volunteer with the Netherlands Red Cross, who is also the outgoing chair of the IFRC Youth Commission, or former by the time this podcast airs, and a young leader in the Red Cross Red Crescent Network on climate action, among many other things. Bas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we're speaking on day one of the statutory meetings of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, or rather the day before the start of the IFRC General Assembly taking place in Geneva, Switzerland. And today is Youth Forum Day. And the Youth Commission met for the 2 days before, I think, and representatives from more than 150 countries will be attending over the next 10 days or so. What does it mean to you to be there, and what do you hope is accomplished in the coming 10 days?
I think the statutory meetings of the Red Cross and Red Crescent is a very special place because it's truly the most universal place that we facilitate where the world truly comes together. Where Red Cross, Red Crescent organizations from around the world discuss to meet very common elements. Whether you're in the Netherlands, whether you're in the Caribbean, whether you're in Africa, it doesn't really matter because we experience very similar challenges in very different contexts, and we can learn a lot from each other. But also we need to set direction together about where do we as a Red Cross and Red Crescent go, and how do the sort of current challenges that we see around the world impact us, and how do we respond to it. And I think having so many national societies here really shows that there is a wisdom in the collectiveness of these national societies. It's not one national society that knows it all. It's together with all of our different expertise and contexts, I think we can really try to build solutions. And I think in today's world, where everything gets so incredibly complex, also for the Red Cross and Red Crescent, I think we need sort of that thinking power of all of those national societies to come to solutions that work not only here in Geneva, but really work in our national societies as well.
As we said, we're meeting in Geneva, Switzerland. What would you say to those young people who perhaps say it's just another meeting and it's happening in Geneva, far away from conflict and climate change? What would you say to them? Will what happens here really have an impact?
I understand very much if people are skeptical about these meetings, right? Because, I mean, here we are in the comfort of Geneva, and many of our volunteers are really at the front lines, really delivering the humanitarian aid and living our principles and values. So many of the words that will be said here in a couple of next days, it's very easy to say those words if you're not faced with those hardships that we are faced with on the ground. So I understand that there's skepticism, and I think what is important for us, for those that are lucky enough to be here in Geneva, many volunteers who come from the front lines, it's important that we integrate their voices, their experiences, and their ideas in the discussion, because things can get very abstract here. And if it's abstract, it means it's not really helpful for a national society. So how do we make sure that voices of young people, voices of volunteers, really influence the discussions here, so that the decisions that we make here actually make an impact in our national society and on the front lines? Because the decisions that we make need to be helpful to our national societies, and that can only be if it's really informed by what is happening. So we need to find a way to bridge that gap between talking sort of abstract stuff to talking about sort of real stuff, what is happening on the ground.
And so people are coming from all over, so the discussion should actually be real, right?
Absolutely, and I think there will be many young people as well, and I think the young people, they are perhaps the most closest to the front lines. And I think, because I mean there's also, and with great respect, but there's also like a large number of presidents, secretary generals, and they know of course what's happening on the ground as well, but they don't always feel it because they are not doing the shift sort of day and night. But many of the young people that are here, I mean they're the ones that are doing that volunteering. So it's really important that we listen to them and that we give space for them to shape the conversation. Not only contribute it, but really shape the direction where we're heading.
I just remembered there was one youth colleague this morning from the Lebanese Red Cross who said she was leading the response in the current crisis. So she's definitely on the front lines at what is happening right now, so she really can bring the real issues to the table. So it was really heartening to hear some of those testimonies this morning. During the forum, you presented the 2022-2024 Youth Commission report, which contained, of course, many interesting, important findings. One thing that I found particularly interesting was the mention of economic instability and socioeconomic trends, which are impacting young people negatively across the board in all kinds of regions and situations. Can you talk about that just a little bit? It seems like this is a growing concern for young people in particular.
Absolutely, indeed. Because economy, we don't often talk about it as Red Cross and Red Crescent, but it talks very much about the future of young people. Because I think after the financial crisis, but exacerbated by the pandemic, I think the economic divides have become even larger. Not only between countries, between cities and rural areas, but also between generations, young people and those that are a little bit more established, for instance. So we see many young people are very much affected by that economic divide and puts them in very vulnerable positions around the world. It's the lack of stable jobs, it is the necessity to support families to avoid the poverty trap, but it's also being vulnerable if there's no jobs. Young people are often recruited into sort of quick wins almost, so for instance organized crimes or exploitation or human trafficking. I think that is a reality that we see in many parts of the world in different sort of contexts, but that is something that we're very much worried about, because that is really sort of a false start of somebody's sort of early adolescent, early adult lifetime, and that really sets the tone for whatever comes ahead in life. And I think perhaps, like for instance, in my country, in the Netherlands, I think we see also more social divides, and that is also not fair. Back in the days, your social class was determined, say, by your intellect and by your effort. But nowadays, it's very much determined by often where you are born, the wealth of your family, and sort of what comes your way through inheritance. And I think that's very unfair, because that divide will only grow larger. If you are born with some privileges, you will keep those privileges and you will grow, or you're at the other side of the coin. It doesn't matter anymore what you do yourself. And I think having that power yourself to make something of your life, that is, I think, that autonomy we need to give back to young people.
The Youth Commission report also says that the IFRC network of national societies must aspire to become the platform of choice for young people, one that empowers them and enables them to transform society and build resilient communities while also nurturing them in their personal development. What do you think needs to happen concretely to ensure that that's the case, so that you or other young people can say to their friends and colleagues, this is a place where you will be heard and be able to make a difference?
I think first of all, as a Red Cross and Red Crescent, or any NGO for that matter, or any institution perhaps, we need to realize that young people don't need the Red Cross and Red Crescent or an institution to make an impact. Young people can self-organize themselves nowadays, and we see it around the world, young people are doing it. But for us as an institution, as a Red Cross and Red Crescent, we do need young people to make that impact and that to deliver on the promises that we make to our communities around the world. So recognizing that it is us facilitating young people rather than the young people facilitating us, I think that is a really important sort of mind shift that we need to embark on. And also that we treasure young people that have chosen the Red Cross and Red Crescent. They're not something disposable. It's not, all right, this volunteer leaves, we'll find another one. I think it's becoming more scarce, and we need to really invest in them. So I think that is sort of one thing. Mm-hmm. And then second is that we need to become really national societies where young people feel empowered, feel heard, and feel enabled to make the change that they want. Young people will not come to the Red Cross and Red Crescent to deliver services that we have sort of already thought about. If they have made the conscious choice to join Red Cross or Red Crescent, they have done so because they want to make an impact. And we need to help them facilitate to make that impact. So what we do very often in national societies, we have these youth-led structures where young people can self-organize about causes that they want to make an impact in. So it's not like, okay, thank you very much, welcome to the Red Cross, here are the 2 programs that you can do. but it's much more a conversation about, okay, what do you see in your community? What is the impact that you want to make, and how can we as a Red Cross Red Crescent help? Of course, within the lines of our strategies, because we have to be focused in where we deliver our aid. We need to make sure that we deliver in accordance with our principles. But it's much more about facilitating volunteers to make the impact that they want to see.
Mm-hmm. We said at the beginning you're concluding your role as the president of the IFRC Youth Commission. You're a bit older now, perhaps wiser. Mm-hmm. What are your big takeaways or lessons that you would like to pass on?
Mm-hmm. I've learned very much serving in this organization called the International Federation is it takes time. Mm-hmm. I remember coming into this role when I was only 23 years old. I was I wouldn't say activistic, but I was very sure what I wanted to change, and it needed to happen within a year because otherwise I was disappointed. But I learned very quickly that change in such a multilateral space really takes time, and you have to be strategic. You cannot, it's how to say, big change is done over generations. I think that's really what I've learned. So, I've been there for a couple of years, and I've planted some seeds, and I grew another few seeds from my predecessors, but it will be myself, my successor, together we will build a better Red Cross and Red Crescent for young people. But there's no one person that can really deliver everything in one mandate. It's really a teamwork, mm-hmm. despite that we were teams after each other and we were not in the same team. So in a way I've become more realistic and much more focused about, all right, I'm here for a couple of years, this is what I want to change. Mm-hmm. There are maybe 3, 4, 5 things, but it's a certain legacy that I can leave behind.
Speaking of change, how do you see the world of volunteering changing?
I see it's changing greatly, actually, and I think maybe it alludes
for the better or worse?
Perhaps both, almost indeed. I see volunteering changing for the better because people are making much more conscious choices why they join an organization. Maybe I wasn't around, but I can imagine a couple of years ago, or maybe 10, 20 years ago, there were less organizations to choose from. So you would go volunteer for the Red Cross because perhaps it was the only NGO mm-hmm. out there. But nowadays there's so much competition out there. So young people or volunteers who join the Red Cross are doing that consciously because they really choose Red Cross and Red Crescent because they believe in its mission. So I think that connection becomes much stronger, but I also see that it's being challenged because there's so much out there. And for young people nowadays, there's a lot of pressure on them as well to achieve great things very fast. And volunteering is also a little bit of an investment in yourself, but mm-hmm. particularly an investment in your community. It doesn't come with automatic returns. You do it because you really feel it's important to make an impact. So, and I think that is a little bit under threat simply because there's so much pressure on young people nowadays to agree to achieve great things that they think, I would love to volunteer, but maybe it's more strategic if I take this extra job or if I take this extra study. Not because they want to, but because they feel that there's pressure on them mm-hmm. and expectation from society to do so.
You also have a day job, right? So you work as a senior manager for international organizations for Deloitte in the Netherlands. In that role, I'm told you've advised leaders of several major humanitarian organizations. So if you were to have a panel of humanitarian leaders in front of you right now, what would you tell them generally about how we need to adapt their strategy to meet the challenges of today and those coming in the future?
That's a good question because that's not always the luxury I have as a consultant, sure. right? Because they ask me questions that they want to be answered. They don't ask for open questions. But if I would advise them, or maybe the humanitarian sector at large, I think it would be good to have a critical reflection in the mirror as well. I think in the last 20 years, the humanitarian sector professionalized a great deal, which I think was very necessary, and I think it really upped what we could deliver for people around the world in a very sort of accountable, transparent way. But I also feel that there's a lot of waste in the sector, huh? I mean, you have to be very precious about the funds that are granted to us, and I think there is a lot of sort of waste of resources as well. That we do things, but we don't always know why we're doing it. And I think making more conscious choices about what we want to do and having a more focused strategy is important, rather than trying to please everyone, which I think sometimes is the case. I think as a sector we become very good at producing reports that arguably nobody reads. But if we only produce a few ones that really matter and will really move the conversation, I think then we can use the other resources that we have to really deliver services on the ground, because that is eventually where we are created for.
So, back to your work as a volunteer, I think you told me earlier that you will continue to be a volunteer in your branch in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. What are the humanitarian issues that you have seen there and that you think you'll be working to address in the future?
Yeah, I'm very excited to go back to my branch where it once started when I joined the Red Cross and Red Crescent 15 years ago, to be, say, a regular volunteer.
15 years ago?
15 years ago.
So
indeed.
can I ask you, how old were you then?
So back then I was 16,
Wow.
indeed. I just started university, and a little secret, I joined the Red Cross because I needed to have extra curriculum points for university.
Okay.
But then I joined the Red Cross and I found, wow, this is such a beautiful organization, and these principles and values are really living in people, that I felt so connected and so welcome that I thought, okay, I really want to make a change. And I come myself from a little bit of a privileged background, come from the countryside, I was brought up in a safe bubble. And when I moved to start my university degree when I was 16 in Rotterdam, I was exposed to sort of say more big city life and everything that comes with it.
Yes.
And I think the Red Cross really helped me to understand that there's another side of the coin, and that like resources and opportunity are not granted equally.
Yes.
And if I look back at my city in Rotterdam, it's a city that's very dear to me. It's an interesting city because it's a big city, but it's divided by a big river. It's a big harbor city, for those who know. And say the wealth of the city is very much in the north of the city, and say the poverty, I would say, almost is more in the south of the city. And that's very much linked to where the harbor is, because the harbor is in the south, and the harbor workers back in the days didn't per se earn so much. But nowadays, the harbor becomes less important for the economy, but you still see that divide in the city. And I think Rotterdam is the poorest city in the Netherlands, and I think that's what we really see. And I really hope that the Red Cross and Red Crescent can create some of that bridge across those inequalities. And it's particularly about giving young people also an opportunity again to make something of their life. An opportunity that they're not always granted in the south of the city where I live.
I see. You and I met once before and had a conversation like this, not for the podcast, but we did a live from Climate Summit, the Climate Summit COP28 in Dubai last year. So I know that climate is an issue that you've been following very closely. What is the message that you would want to share today in terms of how we need to be responding to this threat?
So I think it's the message that everyone has been saying, so to say, that we just need action. I think there's a lot of discussion and a lot of talk, and things are moving, but things are moving very slowly. And what we would need is we would really need governments to take big action, and also understanding that protecting the climate will also mean perhaps a little bit of economic gain. And maybe that's a privileged thing to say as well, coming from the Netherlands, which is a very economically strong country. But I think it's a realization that we need to have, and also that countries like myself also need to be have some solidarity with countries that are, say, less economically strong, and maybe those stronger economies need to take a bigger hit. Because if we don't start really talking about sort of big actions, I mean, the consequences will not be overseen, and humanitarian crisis will erupt everywhere around the world. So I think that's for governments, but then I think everyone also needs to look at something about their own individual behavior or the individual behavior of the company that they work in. Also for us as Red Cross and Red Crescent, we have a big climate and environmental charter, but I think we could do more in creating sustainable policies to really guide our decisions. I wonder sometimes if sustainability is really at the heart of our decision making. Is it something that we are informed about when we make a decision? Because in the end you cannot expect individuals to make the big change. You need to have policies also in organizations, on country levels that will force you to make a change, because individuals per se will not bring that change.
You were speaking about the Netherlands as an economically stronger country that could perhaps help others, support others, or take the lead in addressing climate change. The Netherlands is also very susceptible to climate change. Is this why you got particularly interested in climate, you think?
I think in the Netherlands we're quite well aware about climate change. I'm not sure if we're worried about climate change because we feel that sort of the government has taken enough action and that we are prepared. And it's especially about sort of sea level rise. Most of my country is below sea level. So for instance, the village where I grew up is 15 meters below sea level, but relatively close to the sea. So if the dikes break, then the whole country is in deep trouble, so to say. So I think in the Netherlands you're brought up with that realization from a very early age on. Even though the last big disaster was in 1953, when 10% of the country got flooded. So it's not something that is really alive in everyone's mind per se.
Right.
But we are taught about it a lot. But what worries me, and maybe that is also why I got more active in this space, is because of that contradiction. So we are aware about it, but we're not prepared because we trust our government that everything is taken into account. So even if I look at myself or my own family, if there's like big floods happening today in the Netherlands, I would wonder if we are prepared enough. I don't think so. And I think there is a big role for the Red Cross and Red Crescent to make sure that people are, because in times of crisis, in times of big floods, of course the government will do what it can, but eventually you're really dependent on yourself, your family, and the people around you in your local community, because they are the first one to help. And I think there we need to take much more steps, also as sort of as a country in the Netherlands, but also as a role of the Netherlands Red Cross to make sure that people are better prepared, because we cannot always trust that everything will work out, because at some point nature will potentially take over.
Right. We always ask our guests to bring an object. I'm not sure if you brought anything with you, something that means a lot to you, has a special meaning that you could talk about or show if you brought it, or just talk about it.
So indeed, I have it with me, but not here, I must say. But what I brought is a keychain. It was from one of my trips when I was visiting Côte d'Ivoire Red Cross, and it's a keychain of an elephant. And I thought that was really interesting. It reminds me of something, but it also is a good reminder for the meetings that we have here today,
Yes.
Because there's many elephants in the room that we're not always addressing, because we're maybe a little bit scared. And maybe as a Red Cross and Red Crescent, we want to maintain our independence and neutrality, and it's a fine line. But if you don't address the elephant in the room, you will not make good decisions, because that elephant will always stand in the way. That is something you need to clear out, even though sometimes it's uncomfortable. So I really hope that, maybe my little keychain will be a reminder for myself to address that elephant in the room, but also really for everyone these couple days ahead to not be afraid to ask the difficult questions, because that's really why we came here, to address the difficult things. The easy things we can do online, but it's the difficult things where we need that collective wisdom that I talked about earlier, and we shouldn't be afraid of addressing those.
I have no doubts that the young people will bring those difficult issues up, at least based on what I heard this morning. At the end of the day, with all that's going on in the world, who or what inspires you, keeps you going, or gives you hope?
I think it's many of the people here. Maybe it's a bit cliche to say it, but for instance, This morning I had a chat with Lotfi, a good friend of mine of the Egyptian Red Crescent. You may know him, and just talking to him has been such a big inspiration, I must say, because Egyptian Red Crescent for us is really a strong pillar in the region, not only now with Gaza, but also before with the floods in Libya or the war in Sudan. It's really good to have such a strong national society in the region that we can rely on. But he was also talking about some of the volunteers that he has been working with, who work sort of day and night, who, I mean, because the situation is so unpredictable, they don't take any free time because they feel such a sense of duty to perform their humanitarian duties. And hearing those stories really inspire me because it's the sense of duty that can only come up in times of crisis. And in my own country, in the Netherlands Red Cross, there's perhaps small crises, but there's not big crises that can compare. And seeing that the spirit of the Red Cross and Red Crescent is so universal, but also really comes to life in such situations, I think is something that we can only applaud. And I hope that if I go back to my national society in the Netherlands Red Cross, that once we're faced with, hopefully not, but faced with such crisis, that myself, I can be similar to the volunteers that are now serving with Egyptian Red Crescent, but also that we as a national society have the volunteers and the spirit that we really will rely on if things go south.
So the last question is the question that we ask of everyone. As you know, the name of this podcast is People in the Red Vest. What does the red vest mean to you? It's symbolic, right? But what does it mean to you?
For me, it means unity across Red Cross and Red Crescent, because I've had the privilege of visiting many national societies around the world. And for instance, a question I get asked very often these days is, I mean, you've been 15 years with the Red Cross. What was the most special moment? And the real answer is that there's not one moment. It has truly been every moment. And every moment to be with Red Cross, just to wear your vest, to be part of a bigger group that is, I wouldn't say have a bigger calling, because that is maybe too sort of heroic, but has a common cause that really rolls up its sleeve to get to action and really puts people at the center. I think having that feeling of unity, that we're doing this together, I think that is what the red vest represents for me. And it's something that I'm very proud to wear as well, because I'm one of them indeed.
Thank you, Bas, for your insights and for sharing your experience with me and for allowing us to get to know you a little bit better at the conclusion of your chairmanship of the Youth Commission. Congratulations for the successful mandate, and I wish you all the very best in your future endeavors, hopefully still with the Red Cross, at least a little bit.
All right, thank you, Sasha.